Hi everyone, I'm Kathleen, Senior Backend Engineer at GitLab, working on the Geo team, and we'll talk about geoproxying for secondary sites. First of all, why geoproxying? So before 14.6, without geoproxying, you'd have a separate URL for every geosecondary, and then each secondary would be read-only, so the web UI and API could only serve read operations. After 14.6, when we've implemented geoproxying, now you could have all geosites, including the primary, behind the URL, a single unified URL. So each secondary would proxy web traffic to the primary, so it acts as a read-write site. Therefore, web UI and API requests on the secondary could be used for write operations, which also means that you could now geographically load balance traffic across all your geosites under one URL. How it works, well, the workhorse component for each geosecondary site proxies the web traffic to the primary geosite using the primary site internal URL to proxy those traffic just to make sure this works with a geographic load balancer as well, since the primary has to receive this traffic. However, a small subset of requests are not proxied. In this example, Git requests, read-only requests would not be proxied just because data already exists on the secondary. So we would accelerate those requests by serving data from the secondary directly if it exists. Talking about a few limitations, because we're proxying all the requests that would go through Rails, this means that requests that are not usually going through Rails would not be proxied. In this example, the container registry, which is a separate service, and pages as well, is a separate service. You may need a separate domain just to make sure traffic always goes through the primary for those services. There is also a possible condition where if you have significant replication lag between the primary and your secondary sites, you could have inconsistencies for those accelerated data types. So for example, if you push on the primary, but there is high replication lag, and you try to read from a secondary, you could receive a stale replica. In our tests, this doesn't seem to be a problem, but please reach out in the issue mentioned above if you run into this, because we like to hear your use case and see what kind of problems you're running into. Some frequently asked questions. First of all, what happens if you're using geo proxying and the primary goes down? Well, because all the secondaries now proxy those requests to the primary, and the primary is inaccessible, the web UI and API operations will fail, and also Git write operations will fail. They will return the same errors as you would try to access the primary. However, Git read operations, if the data still exists on the secondary, if the data already exists, they will work, including authentication, because this is one of the accelerated data types. What happens if one of the secondary sites goes down? Well, if you're using a geographic load balancer, requests that would hit that site will fail, clearly because the site is down. But you could also safely exclude it from the balancer, um, and everything should just continue as usual. Traffic should be picked up by the other secondaries. Also, what happens if there is like a major issue, something unknown, or in case of emergency, is there something that you could do? And yes, you could manually disable proxying for a site. There is an environment variable mentioned in our docs that you could set on the application nodes, and that would disable secondary proxy, or you could also change the external URL so they aren't under the same um, under the same single unified URL. You could also exclude it from the load balancer if you have one, or just point it directly to the primary. Also, we've been talking about a single unified URL, but what happens with different URLs? Could we use proxying but use different URLs as before? And the answer is that it's currently still in development. There is a feature flag that you could enable to try out this, but there are some current limitations with this change, and they are mentioned in the epic linked in our docs. And finally, how would you handle TLS certificates when you have multiple sites under the same URL? Well, if you're using a geographic load balancer, the Let's Encrypt verification, if you're trying to use Let's Encrypt, needs to hit the sites in order to verify that the domain is yours. It's a HTTP Let's Encrypt challenge. But what you can do is generate the certificates on one site and copy them to all other sites. Or you could just use your own custom signed certificate. And now I'm going to go through a short demo where we set up unified URLs. We'll start from an existing geo deployment that I've deployed previously using the GitLab environment toolkit. And we're also going to add the geographic load balancer, in this case using Route 53 in AWS as an example. So I have here my two sites, as you can see. This is the secondary site. I'm using a test domain and a subdomain representing the site type. Here we have primary. And then we'll go shortly through the docs for setting up unified URL. First of all, we need to follow the location over public URL docs to create this geographic load balancer. So we need a working primary and secondary, Route 53 hosted zone that I've already set it previously just to add my domain in Route 53. And now we'll create this traffic policy for the geographic load balancer. So we'll go to Route 53 and use create traffic policy. So this is here under traffic management. We'll use single git host as the policy name just to describe what this is about. And here we'll set up our specific conditions. One example is to use the first location will be default. So I'm going to use connect to and then geolocation rule. Okay. And now we have two locations. For the first location, we'll leave it as default and then connect to new endpoint. And here we'll use our primary IP address. In this case, I'll use the IP address of the load balancer I've deployed from my primary site. And for the second location, we'll choose Europe as our rule. And then connect to new endpoint and use our secondary IP address. And that's it for traffic policy. So this essentially means that all traffic coming from Europe will will go to our secondary geo site, while traffic coming from all other locations will go through the primary site directly. So technically everyone in Europe should use our geo secondary site. So we'll create this traffic policy. And now we can just fill in the policy record name with GitLab, which will be our subdomain for this single unified URL. And then we'll create. And this is it. This will be our single unified URL using the geographic load balancer in Route 53. Awesome. So now if we go back, the next step is to update the geosites to use this external URL. So on the geosites, on application nodes, we need to change the external URL to use this URL. So I'm already SSH'd into those nodes. Just for simplicity, I have one application node in each site. So I'm going to edit this and replace primary and secondary with GitLab, which is our unified URL. And we'll run a reconfigure. But we'll also change the external URL in the UI because the primary database needs to reflect this change. So in the admin UI on the primary site, we'll edit every site that is using proxying and the primary to use this URL. So if we go here, let's first change the secondary, and the public URL should be using GitLab. And we'll also change our primary URL to make sure it's using the unified URL. Okay, it's looking good. And we'll run the reconfigure as well. This should apply the new external URL changes and enable proxying on the secondary once this fully starts. Okay, so this will take a bit for it to show up. I'm going to go to this domain, which should be our domain from now. In the meantime, while this starts up, let's go a bit through the docs for secondary proxy. Here is the list of the features accelerated by geosecondary sites through proxying. So as I was mentioning before, all the Git requests, specifically Git read requests, will be served by the local secondary and not be proxied if the data exists. And pushes will always get proxied to the primary, like actual write operations. And we also accelerate LFS objects. So if you pull LFS objects, if you do any read operations from LFS objects where they are already replicated to a geosecondary, then we can serve those objects directly from the secondary and making the entire flow faster. We don't have to we don't have to proxy the primary to get those objects. See if this came back up. Yeah, this is up. So because the load balancer rule said that IPs from Europe will go through the secondary, I'm in Europe, so I'm going through a secondary right now. We can also check that by going to admin, going to geo. It's going to do an authentication here, and it's going to say that I'm on the secondary site. So right now, if we do a quick test, we can create a project. Okay. We could also clone it. I don't have an SH key added because it's a brand new environment, but let's try to clone it through HTTP. Yeah, I should get my password right the first time. Okay, so if we go to demo one, we could also add something just as a test. Change just as a test. We can commit and then push. Hopefully I get my password right this time. Yeah, and we can see the push. We got the notification that this goes through a secondary and will be forwarded to the primary. And if we go back to the UI and we refresh, we can see our change. And that was all for the demo. Thanks everyone.